I've been practicing medicine in rural Montana for 3 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything this isolated mountain community could throw at me. Broken bones from farming accidents, hypothermia from unexpected snowstorms, the occasional bear attack during hunting season. These were the bread and butter of my practice at Pinewood Valley Medical Center. The job was demanding, the hours were long, and the pay was modest, but I loved the simplicity of it all. There was something deeply satisfying about being the only doctor for 50 miles, knowing that people depended on me in ways that city physicians could never quite understand. My wife, Sarah, had initially been skeptical about leaving Seattle for this remote outpost, but even she had grown to appreciate the tight-knit community and the breathtaking beauty of the wilderness that surrounded us. It was a Tuesday morning in late October when everything changed. The autumn leaves had already fallen from most of the trees, leaving skeletal branches reaching toward a gray sky that promised snow. I was reviewing patient files in my small office when Margaret, our head nurse and the woman who essentially ran the clinic, knocked on my door with an expression I'd never seen on her weathered face before. She was normally unflappable, having worked in rural medicine for over 30 years, but now her usual confident demeanor had been replaced by something that looked disturbingly like fear. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the doorframe, and I noticed a slight tremor in her hands that I'd never observed before. "Dr. Matthews, we need to talk about something before the new patient arrives," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I gestured for her to sit down, but she remained standing, as if sitting would somehow make what she had to say more real. Margaret was in her late 50s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that had witnessed decades of medical emergencies without flinching. If something had rattled her this badly, I knew I needed to pay attention. "There's a man being transferred here from the county psychiatric facility," she began, choosing her words carefully. "His name is Thomas Blackwood, and he's been in and out of various institutions for the past 15 years. She paused, seeming to gather her courage before continuing. "The locals here have a history with him, Dr. Matthews, and they're not happy he's coming back." I leaned back in my chair, trying to understand why a psychiatric patient would cause such concern in a woman who had helped me treat everything from chainsaw injuries to childbirth complications in the back of a pickup truck. The psychiatric facility was closing its doors due to state budget cuts, and we'd been informed that we'd be receiving several patients who needed ongoing medical monitoring but didn't require intensive psychiatric care. Thomas Blackwood was supposed to be one of these straightforward cases, a stable patient who simply needed a place to live and regular medical checkups. "What exactly is the issue, Margaret?" I asked, keeping my tone professional but gentle. "The transfer papers indicate he's medically stable and poses no danger to himself or others." Margaret finally moved from the doorway and sat down across from my desk, but she perched on the edge of the chair as if ready to flee at any moment. She folded her hands in her lap, and I could see her trying to organize her thoughts, to find a way to explain something that clearly defied easy explanation. "Thomas Blackwood grew up here in Pinewood Valley," she began, her eyes fixed on something beyond my shoulder. "He was a normal boy until he was about 12 years old, by all accounts. Good student, helped his father with the family's logging business, played baseball with the other kids. Then something happened to him up in the mountains, something nobody talks about directly, but everyone knows about in that way small towns know things." She took a deep breath before continuing. "He came back different, Dr. Matthews. He came back with his eyes closed, and he's never opened them since." The statement hung in the air between us, so absurd that I initially thought I must have misheard her. I'd reviewed Thomas Blackwood's medical files extensively the night before, as I did with all new patients, and while his psychiatric history was complex, there had been no mention of any physical disability related to his eyes. "I'm not sure I understand," I said carefully. "His medical records indicate normal vision with no ocular abnormalities. Are you saying he chooses to keep his eyes closed?" The question sounded ridiculous even as I asked it, but Margaret nodded slowly, her expression grave. "That's exactly what I'm saying, and it's more complicated than just a choice." Margaret leaned forward, lowering her voice even though we were alone in my office with the door closed. "The old-timers in town say that Thomas Blackwood saw something he shouldn't have seen up in the Devil's Tooth mountain range," she said, referring to the jagged peaks that loomed over our valley like broken teeth. His father took him on a hunting trip when he was 12, and they were gone for 3 days. When search and rescue finally found them, Thomas's father was dead, officially ruled as a heart attack, and Thomas was sitting next to the body with his eyes squeezed shut so tight that it took 2 paramedics to pry them open. She paused, and I could see goosebumps rising on her arms despite the warmth of my office. When they finally got his eyes open, Thomas started screaming, and he didn't stop screaming for 6 hours. After that day, he's kept them closed ever since, and anyone who tries to force them open, well, let's just say bad things happen. Thomas Blackwood arrived at our facility on a Wednesday afternoon, transported in an unmarked van from the state psychiatric hospital. I watched from my office window as 2 orderlies helped him out of the vehicle, and my first impression was of how utterly ordinary he looked. He was a man in his late 20s, of average height and build, with dark hair that was neatly trimmed and clothes that were clean and well-maintained. He moved with confidence despite his closed eyes, navigating the steps up to our entrance with only a light touch on one orderly's elbow for guidance. There was nothing about his physical appearance that would have caught anyone's attention in the crowd, except for the one detail that Margaret had warned me about. His eyes were indeed closed, the lids smooth and relaxed, as if he were simply enjoying a peaceful moment of rest. I met them in the reception area, introducing myself and extended my hand in greeting, a gesture I immediately realized was somewhat pointless given that Thomas couldn't see it. But to my surprise, his hand found mine unerringly, the handshake firm and steady. "Dr. Matthews," he said, his voice pleasant and cultured, with only the slightest trace of a local accent. "Thank you for accepting me as a patient. I know my condition makes people uncomfortable." His choice of words struck me as interesting. He didn't say his situation or his case, but specifically his condition, as if the closed eyes were a symptom of something medical rather than psychological. His face was tilted slightly toward mine, and I had the uncanny sensation that despite his closed eyes, he was looking directly at me. The orderlies handed over his transfer papers and a small duffel bag of personal belongings, eager to complete their task and leave. I noticed that they both avoided looking directly at Thomas, and one of them crossed himself quickly before getting back into the van, a gesture that seemed oddly out of place in a medical context. Thomas must have heard or sensed their departure, because a small, sad smile crossed his face. "They're always in such a hurry to leave," he said quietly. "You'd think after 15 years I'd be used to it, but it still hurts a little every time." There was a vulnerability in that admission that immediately humanized him for me, reminding me that beneath whatever psychiatric diagnoses filled his file, this was a person who had been isolated and feared for half his life. Margaret appeared to show Thomas to his room, and I could see the tension in her shoulders as she approached him. She had insisted on being the one to handle his intake, claiming that her experience with difficult patients made her the best choice, but I suspected it was more about maintaining control in a situation that frightened her. "Mr. Blackwood, if you'll follow me, I'll show you to your accommodations," she said, her professional mask firmly in place. Thomas turned toward her voice with that same eerie precision, as if he could see through his closed lids. "Please call me Thomas," he said. "And don't worry, Margaret. I remember you from before. You were kind to my mother during her last illness. I appreciate that." The comment seemed to catch Margaret off guard, and for a moment, her professional composure slipped. I could see her calculating the timeline, realizing that Thomas would have been barely 12 years old when his mother died, shortly before his traumatic incident in the mountains. "You remember me?" she asked, genuine surprise in her voice. Thomas nodded, his closed eyes somehow conveying warmth. "Of course. You have a distinctive voice, and you always smell like lavender soap. Some things stay with you, even through the darkness." The poetic phrasing of that last sentence sent a chill down my spine, and I saw Margaret shiver slightly before leading him down the hallway toward the residential wing. I spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing Thomas's file in greater detail, looking for some explanation for his condition that I might have missed during my initial review. The psychiatric evaluations were extensive but frustratingly vague. Multiple psychiatrists over the years had diagnosed him with everything from conversion disorder to selective mutism to psychogenic blindness, though none could explain why he navigated so effectively with his eyes closed. One doctor had noted that Thomas seemed to possess some form of non-visual spatial awareness that defied medical explanation. Another had written in the margins of a report, "Patient demonstrates knowledge of his environment inconsistent with claimed inability to open eyes. Recommend further neurological evaluation." But no neurological evaluation had ever found anything abnormal about his brain function or ocular nerves. What struck me most as I read through years of medical notes was a pattern of incidents that had occurred whenever anyone tried to force Thomas to open his eyes. In the first institution where he'd been held, a frustrated psychiatrist had attempted to use physical force to pry open Thomas's eyelids during an evaluation. According to the incident report, the moment the doctor's fingers touched Thomas's face, the doctor had collapsed, suffering what was initially believed to be a stroke, but was later diagnosed as a severe panic attack. The doctor had been unable to return to work for 3 months and eventually retired from medicine entirely. In another facility, a nurse had tried using verbal commands and then physical restraints to get Thomas to comply with an eye exam. She had resigned the same day, refusing to explain what had happened except to say that she had seen something she couldn't unsee. The first few days with Thomas as a patient passed without incident, almost disappointingly so given Margaret's dire warnings and the ominous incidents in his file. He was polite, cooperative, and required minimal care beyond his scheduled medication and regular check-ins. He spent most of his time in his room, listening to audiobooks and what sounded like nature recordings, birdsong, rainfall, wind through trees. When I conducted my daily rounds, he would always greet me by name before I could announce myself, somehow knowing who was entering his room, despite his closed eyes and my attempts to move quietly. "Good morning, Dr. Matthews," he'd say cheerfully. "I can hear the way you shift your weight onto your left leg slightly when you walk. Old basketball injury?" He was right, of course. I'd torn my ACL in college and had walked with a barely perceptible limp ever since. On the third day, I decided to conduct a more thorough physical examination, including what I knew would be the challenging part, examining his eyes. Thomas sat patiently on the examination table as I checked his vital signs, listened to his heart and lungs, and tested his reflexes. Everything was remarkably normal for a man who had spent 15 years in various institutions. "Thomas," I said as gently as I could, "I need to at least examine the external structures of your eyes. I'm not going to try to force them open, but I need to check for any signs of infection or abnormality. Is that acceptable to you?" There was a long pause before he answered, and when he did, his voice was tight with tension. "You can look, Dr. Matthews, but please don't touch. And please, no matter what you think you see, don't try to open them." I moved closer, shining my penlight at his closed eyelids from various angles, and what I saw made no medical sense. His eyelids appeared completely normal. No scarring, no inflammation, no signs of any physical trauma that would prevent them from opening. The skin was smooth and healthy, with normal coloration and texture. I noted all of this in my chart, along with my observation that his eyes moved beneath the closed lids in patterns consistent with REM sleep. Even though he was fully awake and conversing with me, "Can you tell me why you keep your eyes closed, Thomas?" I asked. No, it was a question that had been asked hundreds of times before, but hoping that maybe, in this new setting, he might offer some insight. Is it psychological? Physical? Something else entirely? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his head tilted, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. The nature sounds from his room speaker seemed to grow louder in the silence between us. The chirping of crickets, the distant call of an owl. "Dr. Matthews, do you believe that some knowledge is dangerous?" he finally asked. that there are some things humans aren't meant to see or understand. It was a philosophical question masquerading as a response, and I found myself considering it carefully before answering. I believe that knowledge can be traumatic, I said slowly. I've seen patients with PTSD who can't think about certain experiences without triggering severe anxiety. Is that what this is? Did you see something traumatic that makes it impossible for you to open your eyes? Thomas's laugh was soft and bitter. Traumatic, he repeated. That's one word for it, I suppose. Dr. Matthews, what I saw in those mountains wasn't traumatic in the way you mean. It wasn't violence or death or anything that a therapist could help me process and move past. What I saw was truth, a kind of truth that humans aren't designed to perceive while maintaining their sanity. He paused, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on the examination table. My eyes work perfectly. Doctor, better than perfectly, actually. The problem is that when they're open, I see too much. I see what's really there beneath the comfortable illusion that most people live in. And once you've seen that, once you know what's actually looking back at you from the darkness. He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished, but somehow more terrifying for its incompleteness. Despite my medical training and my rational mind, I felt a chill run down my spine at his words. There was a conviction in his voice that was difficult to dismiss as mere delusion. What did you see, Thomas? I asked, knowing even as I spoke that I was crossing into territory that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with morbid curiosity. Up in the Devil's Tooth Mountains, when you were 12 years old, what was it that changed everything? Thomas's hands clenched into fists, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw real fear cross his face. I saw what killed my father, he said quietly. I saw what lives in the high places, in the old places, where humans aren't supposed to go. And worse than that, Dr. Matthews, I saw that it saw me. It's been watching ever since. The session ended shortly after that, with Thomas requesting to return to his room, and I granted the request without pushing for more details. As he stood to leave, guided by his light touch on the walls and an uncanny awareness of obstacles in his path, he paused at the door. Dr. Matthews, a word of advice from someone who's been in this situation for a long time, he said, his voice taking on a tone of genuine concern. Don't try to help me by forcing my eyes open. Others have tried, with the best intentions, and they've all regretted it. Not because I would hurt them. I'm not dangerous in that way. But because once you breach that barrier, once you force my eyes open against my will, you become part of what I see. And I wouldn't wish that on anyone. That night, I found myself unable to sleep, Thomas's words echoing in my mind. Sarah noticed my distraction as we lay in bed, the wind howling outside our small house on the clinic grounds. What's bothering you? She asked, her hand finding mine in the darkness. I told her about Thomas, about his closed eyes and his cryptic warnings, trying to make sense of it all in the retelling. Sarah was silent for a long time after I finished, and when she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful. You know, when I was getting groceries today, the woman at the checkout asked if it was true that Thomas Blackwood was back in town, she said. When I asked how she knew, she said everyone knows everything in a town this small. She also said I should tell you be careful, that some patients can't be cured because they're not really sick. Word spread quickly through Pinewood Valley that Thomas Blackwood had returned, and with it came an escalation of strange warnings and veiled references to events that had occurred 15 years ago. Old Pete, who ran the hardware store and was something of an unofficial town historian, stopped by the clinic on Saturday morning with what he claimed was a delivery of supplies we'd ordered. Margaret took one look at him and sighed, clearly knowing that this was about something other than medical supplies. You might as well come in and say what you came to say, Pete, she told him, and the old man nodded gratefully, his weathered face creased with concern. He shuffled into my office, hat in his hands, looking for all the world like a man about to confess to a crime. Dr. Matthews, I don't mean to stick my nose where it doesn't belong. Pete began, settling into the chair across from my desk with the careful movements of a man whose joints had logged too many Montana winters. But I feel like someone needs to tell you the whole story about Thomas Blackwood. not just a sanitized version you probably got from his medical files. I knew his father, Richard Blackwood, and I was part of the search party that went up into the Devil's Tooth Range to find them when they didn't come back from their hunting trip. He paused, his rheumy eyes focusing on something in the distance, seeing a memory that was clearly still vivid after all these years. What we found up there, Doc, it changed how I look at the world. And I'm not the only one. Pete told me that Richard Blackwood had been an experienced outdoorsman, someone who knew the mountains as well as anyone in the valley. He'd taken his son Thomas on hunting trips since the boy was 8 years old, teaching him the skills that generations of Blackwood men had passed down. But that last trip, Richard wanted to go farther than they'd ever gone before, Pete explained. He'd been hearing stories about elk the size of horses spotted near the old mine shafts up above the tree line, in an area that the indigenous people who used to live here considered forbidden ground. Richard didn't put much stock in superstition. Figured it was just talk meant to keep outsiders away from good hunting grounds. The old man shook his head sadly. Pride go before the fall, as the good book says. When Richard and Thomas didn't return after 3 days, the sheriff organized a search party of 20 men, Pete among them. They followed the Blackwoods Trail up into increasingly rugged terrain, passing the normal hunting grounds and venturing into areas that Pete admitted made even experienced mountaineers nervous. "There's places up there that just feel wrong, Doc," he said, struggling to articulate something ineffable. "The trees grow twisted, the birds don't sing, and you get this feeling in your gut like you're being watched by something that isn't human and doesn't have your best interests at heart." We found them in a small clearing near an old mine entrance, one of those abandoned gold rush operations from the 1800s that the forest has been slowly reclaiming. Richard Blackwood was dead, sitting with his back against a boulder, his eyes wide open, his face frozen in an expression that Pete described as beyond terror, like he'd seen something so awful that his heart just gave out from the shock of it. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest, and given Richard's history of high blood pressure and the exertion of hiking in high altitude, it wasn't hard for the coroner to close the case without asking too many questions. "But, Doc, I looked into Richard's eyes before we closed them," Pete said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "And I swear to you, there was something reflected in them, something that was standing behind us. When I spun around to look, there was nothing there, nothing but trees and rocks and that damn mine entrance." Thomas had been sitting cross-legged on the ground next to his father's body, his eyes squeezed shut so tightly that the muscles of his face were cramping. He was rocking back and forth, humming a tuneless song that Pete said made his teeth ache to hear. When we tried to talk to him, he just kept saying the same thing over and over. "Don't make me look. Don't make me look. It's still there. It's watching. Don't make me look," Pete recounted. 2 of our guys tried to pry his eyes open, figured he must have seen his father die and was having some kind of breakdown. The moment they got his eyelids apart, Thomas started screaming, and I mean screaming like no human child should be able to scream. But worse than that, the 2 men who'd forced his eyes open, they both collapsed, just dropped like puppets with their strings cut. The men, Jake Morrison and Carl Henderson, had been taken to the hospital in the next county, the same hospital where Thomas was initially committed. Jake recovered after a few days, but he'd changed. He quit his job at the lumber mill, sold his house, and moved out of state without saying goodbye to anyone. Carl never really recovered. He'd had what the doctors called a complete psychotic break, claiming that he could see things in the shadows, things that watched and waited. He killed himself 6 months later. And that's why people around here are afraid of Thomas Blackwood, Pete concluded. Not because he's dangerous himself, but because whatever he's keeping locked away behind those closed eyes, it's dangerous to everyone around him. That mine entrance up in the Devil's Tooth was sealed with concrete by the county within a week of the incident. Nobody goes near it anymore. I thank Pete for sharing the story, though I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do with the information. It was clearly local folklore that had grown in the telling, a community's attempt to make sense of a tragic incident involving a father's death and a child's resulting trauma. And yet, I couldn't shake the sincerity in Pete's voice or the fear in his eyes when he spoke about what he'd seen reflected in Richard Blackwood's dead gaze. After Pete left, I found myself doing something I'd never done in my medical career. I pulled up geological surveys and historical records of the Devil's Tooth mountain range, looking for information about those old mine shafts and what might have been up there that could trigger such a profound psychological break in a 12-year-old boy. The historical records were sparse but intriguing. The mine in question had been part of a gold rush operation in 1873, but had been abandoned after only 3 months' operation. The official reason given was that the vein had played out, but contemporary newspaper accounts told a different story. 12 miners had been working the claim when 5 of them disappeared over the course of a single week. The remaining 7 had fled, and none of them would ever speak publicly about what had driven them away. One miner, interviewed on his deathbed 30 years later, had claimed they dug too deep and found something older than the gold, older than the mountains themselves. It was melodramatic stuff, the kind of tale that probably grew more elaborate with each retelling, but it added an unsettling context to Pete's story about what had happened to Richard and Thomas Blackwood. Everything remained manageable until the second week of Thomas's stay, when Dr. Elena Rodriguez arrived at our facility. She was a visiting neurologist from Denver, part of a state program to provide specialist consultations to rural medical centers that couldn't afford full-time specialists. Elena was brilliant, driven, and possessed the kind of supreme confidence that comes from years of solving difficult cases that had stumped other doctors. I'd been looking forward to her visit, hoping she might provide insights into some of our more challenging patients. When I mentioned Thomas Blackwood during our morning consultation, her eyes lit up with professional interest. A patient who's kept his eyes closed for 15 years despite apparently normal vision, she said. That's fascinating. I'd love to examine him. I should have recognized the warning signs. I should have remembered Thomas's warnings and Pete's story and Margaret's fear. But Elena's enthusiasm was contagious, and I found myself agreeing that a proper neurological examination might finally provide some answers. We approached Thomas's room together, and I could hear the nature sounds playing from inside, waves on a beach this time, the gentle rhythm somehow soothing. Thomas greeted us before we knocked. As always, Dr. Matthews and someone new, he said through the door. A woman, mid-30s, walks with very deliberate steps. She's wearing perfume, something floral, expensive. You must be the neurologist. Elena glanced at me in surprise, impressed by his deductive abilities. That's quite a skill you have there, Thomas. We entered the room, and Thomas was sitting in his armchair by the window, his face turned toward the morning light that streamed through the glass despite his closed eyes. Something in his posture had changed since I'd last seen him. He seemed more tense, more guarded. Dr. Rodriguez wants to conduct a neurological examination, Thomas. I explained. Nothing invasive, just some standard tests to better understand your condition. We won't try to open your eyes without your consent. Thomas nodded slowly, but I noticed his hands gripping the arms of his chair tightly. Of course, doctor, he said quietly, though I should warn Dr. Rodriguez that many specialists before her have tried to understand my condition, and none have succeeded. Some have come away worse for the attempt. Elena approached with her examination equipment, professionally detached and methodical. She conducted a series of standard neurological tests, checking his reflexes, his response to various stimuli, his coordination and balance. Throughout it all, Thomas cooperated fully, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched whenever Elena came too close to his face. Remarkable, Elena murmured, making notes. Your spatial awareness is extraordinary. Thomas, you're navigating visual space without visual input, which suggests your brain has found alternative pathways for processing environmental information. I'd love to do an MRI to see what's happening neurologically when you... She stopped mid-sentence, and I saw her professional curiosity override her caution. Thomas, I need to ask, what exactly are you afraid you'll see if you open your eyes? Thomas's response was immediate and firm. Dr. Rodriguez, with respect, that's not a question I'm willing to answer. and I would strongly advise you not to attempt what I can see you're considering." His use of the word see in that context was jarring. How could he see what she was considering? But Elena was already reaching into her bag, pulling out a small pen light. "I'm not going to force anything," she assured him, "but I need to test your pupillary response. It's a basic part of any neurological examination. If your eyes are functioning normally, your pupils should contract in response to light even through your closed eyelids. It will only take a moment, and I won't try to open them." I saw Thomas's whole body go rigid, and for the first time since I'd met him, I heard real fear in his voice. "Please don't do this," he said, his voice strained. "Please, Dr. Rodriguez. I'm begging you. The last time someone did this, they spent 6 months in intensive psychiatric care. I don't want that for you." But Elena, confident in her expertise, and perhaps thinking this was just a manipulation tactic from a long-term psychiatric patient, had already moved forward. "Thomas, I appreciate your concern, but I'm a medical professional. I need to complete this examination." She raised the penlight toward his closed eyes, and even though I knew I should stop her, I found myself frozen, watching as if in slow motion as she aimed the bright beam directly at his face. The light hit Thomas's closed eyelids, and several things happened simultaneously. Thomas's hands flew to his face, covering his eyes with his palms, but not before I saw or thought I saw something impossible. For just a fraction of a second, it was as if his eyelids became translucent, and through them I glimpsed what lay beneath. I can't adequately describe what I saw, because my brain couldn't properly process it. There were eyes, yes, but they weren't looking at us. They were looking at something else, something that existed in a space that overlapped with our reality but wasn't quite part of it. And in that glimpse, I saw shadows move behind Thomas, shadows that had shape and substance and terrible purpose. Elena screamed, not a startled yelp or a cry of surprise, but a full-throated scream of absolute terror that brought Margaret and 2 orderlies running. The pen light clattered to the floor, its beam spinning wildly before rolling under the bed. Elena backed away from Thomas, her hands held up in front of her face, as if warding off something only she could see. "No, no, 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 no," she chanted, her eyes wide and unseeing. "It's still there. Oh, God, it's still there. It's been there the whole time. All of us, we've been walking around with it right behind us. And we didn't know. Her voice rose higher with each repetition until it became an incoherent wail. Thomas remained motionless in his chair, his hands still pressed firmly over his closed eyes, his whole body trembling. "I warned her," he whispered. "Dr. Matthews, I warned her. I warned all of you. The light creates a window, a temporary breach." She saw through my eyes for just a moment, saw what I've been seeing for 15 years, and now she can't unsee it. Margaret was trying to comfort Elena, who had collapsed to her knees, still staring at something behind me that I couldn't see. I turned to look anyway, my heart hammering, but there was nothing there. Just the white wall of Thomas's room and the morning sunlight that now seemed cold and somehow hostile. Closed. We had to sedate Elena before we could move her to one of our observation rooms. She fought us every step of the way, screaming warnings about the watcher and the patient ones and the things that stand behind. Her pupils were dilated, her pulse racing, every symptom consistent with a severe panic attack or acute psychotic episode. But what disturbed me most was the lucidity in her eyes, the terrible certainty that what she was experiencing wasn't a hallucination, but a revelation. As we finally got her settled in a bed with a mild sedative beginning to take effect, she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "Dr. Matthews," she whispered urgently, "don't let them open his eyes. Thomas is protecting us. He's protecting all of us. The only reason we can't see them is because he can. He's holding the door." I spent the next 2 days in a fog of confusion and denial, trying to rationalize what I'd witnessed in Thomas's room. Elena remained under sedation, and when she was lucid enough to speak, she would only say that she couldn't explain what had happened, that it was beyond her ability to articulate in words that wouldn't sound insane. The hospital in Denver sent a colleague to evaluate her, and the recommendation was immediate psychiatric leave and a long break from practice. Elena didn't argue. She packed her things with the frantic urgency of someone fleeing a burning building and left without saying goodbye to anyone except Thomas. I watched from my office window as she stopped outside his room, speaking to him through the closed door. I couldn't hear what was said, but I saw her press her hand against the door for a long moment before walking away, tears streaming down her face. Thomas had barely spoken since the incident. He remained in his room, refusing meals and only accepting water brought by Margaret, who was the only staff member he still seemed to trust. I knew I needed to speak with him, to try to understand what had really happened. But I was afraid, not of Thomas himself, but the implications of what I glimpsed in that terrible moment when the light had struck his eyelids. If what I'd seen was real, if there was even a possibility that it was real, then everything I understood about the world and my place in it was wrong. And that kind of knowledge, I was beginning to understand, was a burden that could break a person. On the third day after the incident, I finally gathered the courage to approach Thomas's room. He was sitting in his usual chair by the window, the nature sounds turned off for once, leaving only silence and the sound of rain pattering against the glass. "Dr. Matthews," he said as I entered, "I was wondering when you'd come. I'm sorry about Dr. Rodriguez. I truly am, but perhaps now you understand why I've kept my eyes closed all these years." He gestured to the empty chair across from him, inviting me to sit. "You have questions. I can hear them in the way you're breathing, in the hesitation in your footsteps. Ask them. I owe you that much after what happened." I sat down heavily, suddenly exhausted. What am I supposed to believe, Thomas? I asked. I'm a doctor. I'm trained to find rational explanations for symptoms and behaviors. But what I saw in your room, I stopped, unable to finish the thought. Thomas nodded slowly, understanding. "What you saw was real, Dr. Matthews. I wish I could tell you it was a hallucination, or a trick of the light, or a mass delusion brought on by suggestibility. But we both know that's not true. You saw, for just a moment, what I see every time I open my eyes. You saw the watchers." Thomas began to speak, and I found myself listening to the most terrifying and bizarre account I'd ever heard from a patient. He explained that when he and his father had gone into that mine shaft in the Devil's Tooth Range 15 years ago, they'd found more than just abandoned mining equipment. Deep in the tunnels, past a point where any sensible person would turn back, they discovered a chamber that hadn't been carved by human hands. The walls had been covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change when you looked directly at them, and in the center of the chamber had been something that Thomas described as a tear in the fabric of what we consider real. His father had approached the anomaly, curiosity overcoming caution, and Thomas had watched as Richard Blackwood had looked into that tear. Dad's face changed the moment he looked into it. Thomas said, his voice distant with memory. It was like watching someone age 50 years in 5 seconds. His expression went from curiosity to confusion to horror to something beyond horror, a kind of understanding that no human should ever have. He grabbed my arm and tried to pull me away, tried to get us both out of there, but it was too late. I'd already seen the edge of it in my peripheral vision. Thomas explained that what existed beyond that tear wasn't another place or dimension in any conventional sense. It was a perspective, a way of seeing reality that revealed what had always been there but was mercifully hidden from human perception. Imagine living your whole life in a house, thinking you're alone, he said, his closed eyes somehow making his words more impactful. Then someone gives you special glasses, and suddenly you can see that there are thousands of things living in your walls, in your furniture, standing right behind you every moment of every day. They've always been there, watching, waiting, existing in the spaces between what we call reality. Most of them are neutral, just observing. But some of them, Dr. Matthews, some of them are very interested in us. According to Thomas, his father had collapsed shortly after pulling him away from the chamber, his heart giving out from the sheer psychological shock of what he'd comprehended. But before Richard died, he'd made Thomas promise something. He told me to close my eyes and keep them closed until we were found. Thomas said. He said that as long as I couldn't see them, they couldn't fully see me. It's not perfect protection. They know I'm aware of them. They know I can perceive them when my eyes are open, but it creates a kind of barrier. My closed eyes are like a locked door. As long as the door stays closed, they stay on their side, and I stay on mine. I listen to all of this with a mixture of fascination and skepticism, my medical training warring with what I'd witnessed. Thomas, what you're describing sounds like a severe trauma response. I said gently, you experienced something terrible. Your father's death in a confined, frightening space. It's not uncommon for the mind to create elaborate explanations to protect itself from unbearable reality. Thomas smiled sadly. I knew you'd say that, Dr. Matthews. Every doctor I've ever spoken to has said some variation of the same thing. And I understand. It's easier to believe I'm delusional than to accept what I'm telling you is true. But you saw something in my room when Dr. Rodriguez used that light. You saw the shadows move. You felt it, even if you can't admit it to yourself yet. He was right, and we both knew it. I had seen something, felt something, and no rational explanation I constructed in the past 3 days have been able to fully dispel the memory of that moment. Let's say, hypothetically, that what you're telling me is true. I said carefully, these watchers, as you call them, what do they want? Why are they interested in humans? Thomas leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked incredibly weary, as if the weight of his knowledge was a physical burden. I don't know what they want, not entirely, he admitted. But I know that human attention feeds them somehow. When we see them, acknowledge them, fear them, it makes them more real, more present in our world. That's why forcing my eyes open is so dangerous. It's not just that the person sees what I see. It's that by opening that window, by creating that breach, they give the watchers an opportunity to become more visible, more present. Thomas told me that over the years, he developed a theory about why the watchers remained largely hidden from human perception. I think there are rules, Dr. Matthews, ancient rules that even they have to follow. They can't just manifest fully in our reality without an invitation, without someone opening a door. Most people go their whole lives without ever seeing them, because they instinctively avoid the places and practices that would make them visible. But there are thin places, weak spots in the barrier, like that mind shaft, like certain times of night, like moment of extreme trauma or altered consciousness. And there are people like me, who've seen behind a veil and can't unsee it. The conversation lasted for over an hour, and by the end of it, I was exhausted and more confused than ever. Thomas had answered every question I posed with a calm rationality that made his impossible claims sound almost reasonable. He spoke of the watchers the way a biologist might speak of a newly discovered species, with a mixture of fear and reluctant fascination. Before I left, I had to ask one more question. Thomas, if what you're saying is true, why stay here? Why not find some way to end this burden you're carrying? His expression became fierce, more intense than I'd ever seen him. Because, Dr. Matthews, I'm the only one who knows they're there. I'm the only one watching the watchers. If I give up, if I die or lose my mind completely, then no one will be keeping count. No one will notice if they start breaking the rules. And if they break the rules, if they cross over completely into our reality without anyone aware enough to witness it happening, then everyone is at risk. My burden protects more than just me. It protects everyone who doesn't know they need protecting. Now, as I sit in my office on a quiet afternoon in late autumn, marking nearly 6 years since Thomas Blackwood walked into my life, I find myself reflecting on everything this experience has taught me. The medical center has evolved into something unique, a place where conventional medicine meets the inexplicable, where patients with extraordinary perceptions can find support without judgment. Dr. Marsh's network has grown to over 100 members worldwide, and Thomas remains at its heart, a mentor and guide to others who've glimpsed what lies behind a veil of ordinary reality. Thomas still keeps his eyes closed. He's 31 now, and he's built a life of meaning and purpose despite, or perhaps because of his condition. He's written a book under a pseudonym, sharing strategies for managing expanded perception. He conducts weekly support sessions for network members. He's even developed a relationship with Emma, the Australian girl he mentored years ago, their connection deepening through shared understanding of realities most people will never perceive. The town of Pinewood Valley has made its peace with Thomas. Children grow up knowing his story, learning that the world contains mysteries that demand respect rather than explanation. The mine sites of Devil's Tooth Range remain sealed and marked, their warnings heeded by all but the most foolish. Sheriff Chun maintains protocols for unusual incidents, and the tribal council works with us to preserve traditional knowledge about the thin places. I've changed too. I'm no longer the doctor who believed medicine had answers for everything. I've learned that sometimes our role isn't to cure but to witness, to support, to help people live with dignity amid impossible circumstances. Sarah and I have stayed in Pinewood Valley, raising our daughter here, teaching her that wonder and terror often occupy the same space, and that compassion matters more than certainty. Sometimes, late at night, I still sense something watching from the corners of our bedroom. Sometimes I catch movement in shadows that shouldn't move. But I've learned to live with these perceptions, to acknowledge them without letting them consume me. Thomas taught me that how to coexist with mystery, how to maintain humanity in the face of the inhuman. The Watchers, if they exist, continue their vigil. Thomas continues his. And I continue mine, caring for those who see too much and helping them find ways to bear their extraordinary burdens. This is my story. This is Thomas's story. This is the story of a rural doctor who learned that the universe is stranger and more terrible and more wonderful than any medical textbook could ever capture. And Thomas Blackwood, the patient who never opens his eyes, remains our guardian at the threshold, holding doors closed that were never meant to be opened, protecting us all from truths we're not ready to face. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some doors aren't meant to be opened. And some patients aren't sick. They're simply more aware than the rest of us can bear to be. That's the truth I've learned to live with. And somehow that's enough.